Hello, everybody, and welcome to Audiobooks Don't Forget the Tech, the first ever webinar from the Audiobook Creators Alliance. My name's Neil Gardner. I'm the founder of the ACA. I'm also the managing director of Ladbroke Audio. You've probably heard me making noise on the internet and raring up the audiobook industry because it's a fabulous industry and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that we all do. Whether you're a narrator, a producer, an engineer, an editor, a proofer, maybe you're a composer or a sound designer, but also you're an author. Whatever you do to help make audiobooks a reality, be you a publisher, whoever you may be, isn't this a wonderful industry? And it's just been June, and June, of course, is Audiobook Month, but now it's July. It's July. I'm going to call it July is Audiobook Production Month because we need to focus on what's important. As important with audiobooks, which is the quality of production, techniques, technical stuff. And I want to give a big thank you to everybody who works on the technical side of audiobooks, whether you're a professional, long-standing producer or director, or maybe you're a narrator who's just got into home recording and self-editing or self-directing, and particularly to the proofers and the freelancers out there who really help make sure that every product we release is fantastic. The ACA is a collaborative group that was formed a couple of years ago. The idea is to bring together everybody on the creative side of the audiobook industry to basically help each other out, share best practice, knowledge, information, news, articles, and really just to bring up to the forefront issues that affect all of us. And we're rebooting ourselves post-pandemic. It's time to give the ACA a bit of a spruce up, a bit of a clean. The first step of that is to launch this series of webinars. We hope to do between 4 and 6 of them during the year. And bit by bit, hopefully they will unlock lots of useful information and lots of fabulous people. So you're very welcome. And hello to you all. I wish I could see you, but I can't. I'm here in my home booth. Yes, a studio owner with a home booth. There's something very strange about that, but it means I can talk about both sides, which is always exciting. Now, with me today, we have some fantastic panelists. We have from the publishing, technical side of the publishing industry, Mr. Chris Thompson. I'm going to look down at my piece of paper to make sure I get everybody's job titles right. Chris is the senior producer at Penguin Random House, has a very illustrious background in audiobook production and directing. We also have the incredible Jennifer English, who's the co-owner of Chocolate Fox Publishing. She's a producer, director, editor, proofer, and awesome narrator, and all-round good egg. We have Paul Stark, the senior audio manager of the Orion Publishing Group, which also includes Galance. He is responsible for hiring many of us and helping bring to the market some incredible audiobooks. And then finally, we have the amazing Richard Hughes, who is the MD of Anywhere Audio. He's a producer, director, also an editor, a musician, and an all-round fabulous kind of chap who's made far too many audiobooks across far too many years. And I'm in awe. I'm in awe of all of them. They're incredible individuals, one and all. Look at them all. Look at them. Look at them there. Aren't they lovely people? Ooh, gorgeous. And they're going to be my panelists today. I'm going to be looking after them, giving them virtual cups of tea and just keeping them on the straight and narrow. And the format for today is each panelist has a topic to do with the production and technical side of audiobooks. And as a panel, we're going to discuss those between ourselves. But also, as you'll see, if you look at your ReAttendance dashboard, you'll see there's I'm going to look at mine. It's over here. There's a chat box that you can click on, and that will open up a small box in the side of the screen, and you can ask questions as we go along. It would be fantastic if you'd like to ask anything within the topics as we discuss them, or if there's something you're not following, if you'd like more details, or actually if we're just getting too nerdy and you want us to move on, that's great as well. Send all that over to us in the ReAttendance chat box, and we'll get on with that. We're going to have a couple of sessions first, a couple of topics first, and then we'll break for a full Q&A for 15 minutes, a couple more sessions, and then a final full Q&A at the end. This really is all about you guys in the audience getting involved, asking questions, and we'll follow along, really. So if everybody's happy with that, I think we'll dive into our first question, our first topic, I apologize, with our first panelist, and we're going over to senior producer of Penguin Random House, that's Chris Thompson. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Lovely to see you. So Chris is going to be starting us off.
So it's dropping in and out.
So, well, whilst we wait, hopefully, for Chris's broadband to kick in, he's going to be looking at and discussing with us the importance of preparation, and that's preparation from all sides, for narrators and producers, technical preparation, and everything else. So, I'll hand over to Chris to get that up and running, and then the rest of the panel will dive in.
Right. So what I wanted to broach today was the subject of, I guess, prep, but generally front-loading the process in audiobooks. I come from a relatively small studio in Soho that I worked for 8 years, and then moved to a big publisher, Penguin. And obviously that's given me a bit of a bird's eye view of what's happening across the industry. So I think it's been really interesting to sort of see how things are done everywhere, how things are done. And I guess the one sort of theme that I'm seeing pretty much everywhere is that audiobooks are labour intensive process in terms of.
I think we're losing you, Chris. I think we've lost him. He's disappeared into the Ethernet.
From commission, well, in the case of Penguin, some publishers have commissioning editors, from casting all the way through to put in to make all the decisions as much as possible before you get into the studio. So what that means is any particular topics or any particular requirements for the book ideally would be passed on to the production before any from a producer's point of
view. There we go. First webinar, there had to be at least one gremlin. What can we say? Well, we'll get Chris back and we'll keep talking about prep. Whilst you're waiting, oh, there you are. He's back. And smiley as everything. Hello. We lost you for a moment there. Can you hear me? We can now. Hello.
Okay, I'm so
sorry. This was typical. It had to happen. I thought it would be me with one of the cats destroying the broadband at home, but no. Do you want to continue? I think we've lost Chris for now. Tell you what, whilst we wait, maybe he can log off and log back on again. Guys, so panel, the importance of prep. So let's start with Jen. So as a producer and a director, what prep do you find the most important from both a technical perspective and also when working obviously with narrators and talent?
So for me, it's really important, like first and foremost, that the pronunciations, the vocabulary is correct. And I will, as a producer, often go through, depending on how much prep time you have, but go through the book and pick out your foreign words and your anything difficult or archaic, and be checking. OED is my first port of call because, you know, the classic. And you can become a member by joining your local library. So it is free, or you can pay for it. But yeah, that's my first go-to. And then I'll go to how do you say Youglish, Forvo, and make sure that I get more than one version of it, like somebody's pronunciation, because of course you can get accent variants, and also people get it wrong. People will upload it to Forvo or say it incorrectly in Youglish. So I think it's really important that you get more than one or two. Yeah, so I'll go through and make sure they're consistent. Yeah, generally keep an eye, because I think you work with narrators and you know they've done the prep. And sometimes you get new people, or sometimes old hats who just haven't done their homework. And I think it's a really important job as a producer to be checking all the way through and making sure that you know, the character is Australian all the way through and doesn't change halfway through the book. It's happened. Yeah, so yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Great. So, Paul, as a publisher, obviously, we're all producers, us three here. So we tend to obviously we have our own level of prep. But as a publisher, and if you're booking the talent yourself directly, is there anything you get involved with in terms of preparation, putting them in touch with authors? Is there any technical preparation that the publisher can, should, or does do?
Sure. So it's not necessarily always going to be a requirement to kind of facilitate direct communication between reader and producer and author, but it's certainly not something that we actively discourage. So it's always good to hear from readers and producers who are keen to get in touch with the author and really discuss the book, and indeed vice versa. So that's always something we like to hear. Kind of in terms of kind of more generally, I always think that the more marked up a script, when you kind of go and pay a visit to the studio, the more marked up the script, the better the better it looks, because you can see that someone's really thrown themselves into the preparation. From our part as a publisher, we do absolutely everything we can to make sure that the producer and the reader has that final recording text a minimum of a week before the recording actually starts. Anything less than that, you're running the risk of kind of cutting corners. It's not always possible, but we want to make sure there's as much time as possible so that preparation can be thorough and not rushed. That's a key one. We'll do a kind of an awful lot of prep as well behind the scenes that won't necessarily kind of touch what the producer and what the reader are doing. So we'll be doing lots of work around kind of what are the aspirations for the title, what's the author's previous publishing experience been like, dare I say other things like internal politics that we have to bear in mind in terms of the whole production and casting process. That's just something that we kind of have to worry about in advance, and it shouldn't really impact what's kind of happening from a production perspective, but it might explain sometimes some of what, shall we say, what might seem to be slightly odd decisions and that get made, and points where heels kind of get dug in ways that perhaps don't necessarily make sense. That's usually because the publisher is having to handle something behind the scenes. But if we're doing our job properly, that won't impact what's happening from a production perspective. Talking personally, I'm not a producer myself, so I don't get too heavily involved in the technical side of things. I'll come into that a little bit later on. So a lot of what we do there is trusting that the producer and the reader is doing their homework accordingly.
Fantastic. I think Chris has managed to get back through the small pipelines of the broadband internet-y thing. So hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Shall we go back to you and your lovely points?
No, I think, I can actually pick up on the stuff I've just heard, which is actually, I think the interesting thing coming from a small studio into a big publisher is that you sort of get a bit of a bird's eye view. And what you realize is that on most books, on any given book, there's probably between 5 and 7 different people working on it at any given time. And those people don't always hear from each other at all. And the way I see things, the way I've always seen things, is that the expensive part of production really is actor time and studio time. Basically, that's the actual recording process. That's the thing that's the biggest hit, basically, in terms of putting something together. And I think actually you can align sort of workflow interests with performance interests, which basically means if you can do as much of the work and make as many of the decisions before you hit the studio, the whole process becomes better for everyone. And for everyone, I mean for the producer, for the actor, because those decisions have been made, you're just executing a plan. For the editors, because they don't have to trawl through 12 takes of the same line. For the proofers, because they're going to have to catch fewer errors because the edit is going to be simpler. And actually, that can, to be honest with you, that effort also can be traced back all the way to the publisher as well, which is something that we mentioned earlier on. But this thing of once an actor is cast in a book, there's a reason that the actor was cast. Generally, it's gone through author approval. There are certain things that are in the author's head that can be passed on to the producer and the reader directly, and can save a whole lot of sort of back and forth email traffic, but also means that you can prep the book with that information in mind, which doesn't, the classic is an actor will come in and say, oh, well, I imagined the main character's name was pronounced this way, and the poor actor's got to go through the whole thing and change it each time, and that's not always easy. I think that's I would say that would be my general observation now, having been at Penguin for coming up to a couple of years, which is that actually the more effort that we can put early on in the process, the better the whole thing ends up. So what that also means is that because the studio part of things isn't as strained, the actor can focus on actually performing and on executing the plan and not worry about all this other stuff, because everyone feels comfortable basically with those decisions. And that does really trickle down. I mean, I was an editor before I was a producer, and I've been through the hell of trawling through a very difficult book or a book that's been very tricky. No one likes it. And ultimately the best books, to me anyway, feel like a live performance of a book, basically.
Absolutely, I completely agree. It's one of those things that first things the ACA did when we launched a couple of years ago was to put together a preparation information sheet, which we hope at some point the publishing industry might take on board as a standard thing, so that when they're at the point of commissioning the audiobook, this form, which anyone can find in the ReAttendance main page, it's available as a downloadable PDF, that when it's commissioned, this piece of paper or their in-house version of it is given to either the author or the editor or someone who knows the book inside out, and they may not need to ever fill it out, but it has those questions. Do you have particular language issues, accent issues, pronunciations, stuff that would just save a lot of time and effort up front if that was made available to the producer and the narrator particularly. It doesn't mean that person shouldn't do their prep, of course. It's not avoiding prep, it's just helping with that process. So I completely agree. Out of interest, we do have our first question, by the way. It's slightly off topic, but do you mind me throwing it in there? It's for Chris, and I could answer this very easily for you because I know, but here we go. Does Penguin solely use celebrities to narrate their titles?
No. I think perhaps the big titles that you've heard of and the ones that get all the marketing push will be the titles with celebrities. So perhaps that's perhaps why it's perceived that way. But no, absolutely not. In terms of the list, there is a lot of stuff that isn't narrated by celebrities.
Great, thank you. Richard, as a producer, director, what things do you do in terms of, say, preparing a studio or preparing a session for a job? So things you reach out to the narrator, what technical issues, microphones, anything else? What sort of technical things do you need to do and think about if you're prepping a recording?
I mean, I always think one of the key things with this whole job of being a producer is the flexibility to go with the narrator as much as you can, because relaxing and putting the narrator in a comfortable place is usually one of the best ways of ensuring a good performance. So having that flexibility when you go in to adapt yourself a little to what their needs might be is really important. So in terms of prep, things like, just being prepared to move the schedule around them, making sure things are available. I mean, again, it also depends on where I'm working. So as a freelancer, I might be in all sorts of different studios across London, or indeed over the last year and a half, as often remote from home, which is a whole different kettle of fish. If it's a studio and I'm going in physically, then I mean, the key is, if it's somewhere I don't know, obviously go in earlier. Give yourself time to be acquainted with where the facilities are, where just basic stuff like that, so that when whatever the reader might need is on hand. Again, there's a question about the reader. If it is someone of a higher profile, there'll inevitably be more sensitivities around that person, and being aware of that as much as possible in advance is also important. So I mean, it's a lot of the stuff we've touched on already. That communication in advance is really key with the commissioning editor or whichever producer or studio you've got it from, to have that info to prepare yourself for what the session might be like. And in terms of remote producing from home, I mean, the key really is being in touch with that reader in advance, reaching out, and ideally having a phone call. I found myself with pretty much every book I did over the last year and a half having a good phone chat with the reader in advance. And sometimes, if it's a very experienced person, that chat could even be 10 minutes. You know, it's just a reach out. Are you happy with everything? And also some of your own thoughts about the book. It's always useful to just make sure that you're both on roughly the same page about the approach, especially if there's anything that you really want to say about the style, you know, the feel of the piece. If it's a, I don't know, particularly poetic work of fiction, then I think, you know, it's worth saying to them, we want a slightly gentle approach, you know, or if it's an action or fast-paced book, you know, whatever that might be. But sometimes, especially if it's a new reader, that phone call could be, I think I've been on the phone for half an hour with someone before, sometimes longer, you know, just really talking them through every little aspect, because as I say, that talking through every minutiae of how it's going to go is the way to relax that reader. And when they're relaxed, that's how I think you get the best possible performance.
I think it's easy to assume when you've been in the business for a while that it's obvious how you prep a book or what the process is going to be like. It's amazing, actually, because obviously it's not obvious until you've done it. There's a lot of stuff that's quite weird about the whole process, and there's a lot of stuff, and even in terms of prep, you've got to read a book as if it's being read out loud, not to yourself, which is sort of unlearning something you've known all your life, basically.
It's so funny you say that. That's a note I've started giving more recently to people, which is, this is weird. If you've not done it before, this is a weird thing to do. You will be sat listening to your own voice for 3 days. For 3 days, just you, with someone telling you off, or not telling you off, but correcting you, you know, jumping it down again and saying, not like that. It's unnatural. I think that's a really useful note,
And actually, it's something I say to a lot of authors when I'm talking to them is, before you submit your final, whatever the terminology in the industry is, draft revision, read it aloud, because it could be perfectly grammatically correct on the written page, but it just doesn't sound right when it's read aloud. And I know how much hard work is put in by publishing editors to make sure it's perfect on the page. But I've got to say, sometimes when it hits us in the studio, it's like that desperate desire to change a few words just to make it flow better. And so I say that to a lot of authors, but I think it's very important that particularly first-time narrators know that they should practice out loud before they come to the studio or go into a booth. Okay, great, fantastic. This is really going well. I'm excited. It's my first webinar and it's going well so far. This is good. This is good. So we've still got a couple more minutes on this topic with the panel. I'm just looking down to see what questions we have. We've got something about casting, but we'll come on to that a little bit later, Kerry, if you don't mind. But yes, so in terms of technical prep, for example, the things I'll try to do is get in touch with the narrator in advance and but this is for studio work, find out if they have any particular dietary needs or things that they like to drink, milks that they prefer, teas they prefer. Also, bizarrely, I talk to them about clothing, because of course different clothing can make a lot of impact in a studio. Jewelry, ticking watches. I had to tell someone off recently about constantly wanting to bring a can of fizzy drink into the booth, and it's like, no, my microphone's too good, it's going to pick up the fizzy drink. If you're working in your own home booth, particularly like the one I'm in now, which are very small, absolutely anything can become a problem for you. So at the start of your prep for the book, think about how you're going to actually record it. Are you going to be standing up or sitting down? What materials are your desks made out of? Where's your microphone placement? You know, all these things, as producers and engineers, we kind of think about them naturally, but I've had a number of people who've come to me over this last year and said, where do I put the microphone? I thought, that's a really important thing. I know that secondhand where to put a microphone, but maybe you don't. How about you guys?
Can I add one? Ticking watches. It's a really weird one. It's really difficult to edit out. People put their watch next to the microphone. Where do I put the microphone? And I would also add, which way does the microphone face? I'm not going to name anyone, but I've had in the last 6 months at least 2 actors who have sent me a sample. So I don't understand why it's not working. So which way is the gold dot facing?
The gold dot.
The gold dot. That's the trick.
This is anyone
yeah.
with a Rode microphone, basically. If you don't know what we're talking about, if you've got a Rode microphone, there is a gold or silver dot, and that is the front of the microphone. It might look like you can speak from any side of it, but they're actually front-facing microphones unless you spend a lot of money. So look for that gold or silver dot. Yeah, I've had it as well with a poor narrator who ended up re-recording an entire 8-hour book. So that was from home, obviously, not the studio.
And can I throw something in which may sound overly simple, but it has tripped up a couple of books that we've worked on, and it's going to sound really basic, but particularly if you're new to recording from home and you're not it's your first few books out of the studio, know how to save, know how to export, know how to back it up, because we've had a couple of books where whole days, whole sessions have just been lost because of a couple of incorrect or missed button clicks, and all of a sudden all of that work's disappeared.
Yeah.
So it sounds really basic.
Yeah. But it's essential. That leads on as well to the probably the most important part of the tech setup, which is the test session for someone who's recording from home, making sure whether it's on that first morning when you start or whether it's in advance, which is probably slightly preferable in some ways. You test, record a little bit, make sure that the reader understands exactly, as you say, Paul, where it's saving, how to get the file out, and that it has definitely recorded and caught it. Vital.
And then remember to press record.
Yes.
Yeah, always a good one. In fact, actually, what's fascinated me in the last year or so with that side of things is that so many people working from home, but they're not running a backup. And if you go to a studio, there'll nearly always be some probably old technology like a DAT machine doing a backup in the background, or a hard drive just taking a permanent copy in the background. But people at home haven't been told how to do that. How do you set up a second record line in Reaper? If you're doing rock and roll recording, you stop, go back, drop in. But how do you stop that doing it on the second line if you want to? It's fairly simple stuff. But until someone teaches you how to do it, then people do lose recordings because of computer failure. So yeah, which is fascinating, because this brings us directly bang on time to the next panelist, which is Jennifer, and she's talking about producing and editing, which is just what we were doing. So look at that for a segue. I'll hand over to you.
So yeah, I'm a producer and editor, and I'm also an actor. So from all sides, which is really nice. But I think the reason why I got into audiobooks in the first place is because I really like reading. And it's interesting, I think I've not seen a lot of that, weirdly. I wonder if, because I think a lot of producers I've met have come in via music or from a technical point of view. And for me, that's really where the artistry comes into it, and where you get an audiobook to a really, really brilliant audiobook. And I think even editing, there is an art to it, and it's not just removing the clicks and choosing which breaths to go. It's pacing. It's knowing, okay, this is a thriller. Let's ramp it up. This is a really tense section. And that's the producer's job as well, I think, is to find that pace. And because I think sometimes actors, it's hard when you've got 3 days of listening to yourself and you're bored and a bit hot, and you're not necessarily as present as you might have been on the first day. And I think it's our job to guide that, to really keep that going. And I think, editing, I think it's just as creative, or it can be, as the rest of it. It's not just a technical thing to do. I feel that's really important. I think I really notice, just as an editor, sometimes when I've got a producer that seems to really care, or pretends to care, because they're not always good, but really has invested in that book. And not many do. I really find the difference. So yeah.
Fantastic, absolutely. I mean, for me, the role of the producer director is ostensibly the first listener. to the book. You have a lot of technical things you have to do, and most of us are also the engineer nowadays. It's very rare that you have the old multi-person role. But you are the first listener. You're the narrator's cheerleader. You're there to help them through. You're the man manager, if you like that phrase, which I don't. And you're there just to get the performance out of them. But that means you shouldn't be scared of being a director at times. Yes, they are the talented one with the performance ability, but it doesn't mean they're always going to get it right. And I do find it's important that producers know that they can step in and say, actually, could you do that differently? You know?
I think that's key. It's about that suggestion, isn't it? It's about a possibility, and that always, again, as I was saying earlier about the being flexible around the narrator, I find, I mean, it does depend person by person. Sometimes you will work with people who are less receptive to that, but I think without doubt the best books are ones where there's a willingness for it to be a bit of a dialogue between both of you. And I think the way as a producer to do that, as you say, Neil, is to suggest. You just say, what about this? Would this be an option? Do you think we could try this another way? Sometimes coming back at the end of chapters or the end of sections to say, I just wondered about this passage here. Maybe we could wrap the tension up a bit more and see how that sounds. Because often, as a producer as well, you're not certain. You're just trying. You just think that might give us something more. Let's have a go. And so I think, yeah, that sort of that sensitivity to not forcing it too hard is important as well. But to have that dialogue.
Another way to look at it, for me anyway, is that it's almost like a 10-hour monologue, really. And would you really want to do that without someone chipping in and saying that didn't work? And it's obviously it's impossible to get every single line delivery right in 10 hours. Of course, you need that input. And actually, certainly the feedback I've received is that a lot of people prefer to have that there anyway, because it otherwise it can feel a bit sort of, I guess, a bit lonely, and you don't have someone to sort of bounce ideas off. And well, to me, the producer role very much is to sort of take the burden of the questioning of the sort of self-correction off the reader's shoulders, so they can focus on just being in the moment. And here's the incredible thing: it's something that I've noticed. All sorts of other things fall into place after that. If a reader can get to a position where they're not worrying about getting all the words right, their mouths stop making clicks. That's weird, but it does work. But also they stop stumbling because they're not in the booth on the page, looking at the page. They're in this world that they're creating inside their head. And I think that's, to me, that's the best input that a producer can have, is to take that burden off the reader's shoulders.
Absolutely. It's a bit like, when I'm talking to new readers particularly, I say to them, it's a bit like driving a car. When you first learn to drive a car, you're thinking about every movement your arms are making, your hands are making, your feet are making, and it's scary, and you get it wrong and things trip up, and but after you've done all your lessons, passed your tests, you've driven for a while, suddenly it becomes second nature. You can actually find yourself driving a car badly when you're thinking about how to drive a car. And I find that with narrating, myself as a narrator and producing the narrators, that let them get into that flow, take them as far out of the technical side of things as possible, and just let them perform, let them be there. Jen, we've actually got a question for you, as an editor. So this has come from Adam, asking Jennifer, silent room tone level around -75 dB. I think room tone is a good question for us to hear anyway.
Yeah, it depends on the publisher. It depends on who you're working for. I've worked for some people that like that low. I find if it's that low, I think you can hear it. I think you can hear that it's false. I personally like the presence of a room. So, like, obviously, if there's a hum, or you want a quiet studio to begin with. You want a high quality studio to begin with. We don't want to hear your rumbling traffic outside. We don't want to hear helicopters, but you want to feel like you're in a room with someone. You don't want it to sound robotic, which I think if you have very low, and that's just a personal preference. I've worked for American publishers that really like every breath removed and it to sound so crisp. And I personally prefer a slightly more natural read. But it depends. Yeah, it depends on your publisher. It depends on the studio you're working with. And the specifications.
Actually, I think it sort of depends what illusion you're trying to create. Actually, it's whether we're thinking about this as a film or something where everything is cut together and you're hearing this cut together thing, or whether we're trying to trick the listener into thinking this is just someone reading you a story. They're just really good at it, and it's continuous. And that's a choice. I mean, I know some people who do prefer things to be squeaky clean. It's not my personal preference, but as you say, it really depends.
And it depends on the reader as well. There are some readers that breathe beautifully and it really adds to the storytelling. And there are others that every single breath, there's horrible mouth noise in it. And you just have to get rid of everyone, because otherwise, I think it really depends on whether it adds to the storytelling or it distracts from it. And that's, an editor's art, really, and it is their judgment. Keep creating.
Absolutely. And I think that tied with pacing, tied with the decision making on which breaths to remove or which ones to diminish, that really is the reason why editors are as important as producers, are as important as narrators, are as important as proofers. This is a small team that make audiobooks, but every role has a purpose, and having someone who's there who can just tidy stuff up, make a decision, small tweak, and just the number of times I've had a giggle with a narrator who's come back after doing a book months before and said, I get all these amazing reviews and everyone's saying how smooth my reading is, but didn't I make lots of mistakes? And you're like, yeah, you did. But, as a team, the team pulled it together and made this incredible end result. You brought the performance and the character and the voice and the tonality. I brought the pressing the buttons and making the tea, and Jen brought the repacing and the debriefing and the everything elsing, and whoever did the proofing made sure it was all right at the end. That's the team effort. That's what audiobooks are, along with the awesome author and the publisher who brought us the job in the first place. That's what it should be, and that's what I think we need to celebrate more and more, is that yes, there are people who do it all themselves and take it on, and I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they've got the time and the effort and the energy, but well done to them that managed to do it. But particularly breaths is a really important one. Actually, we've got a question from Samuel Wilkins, who takes part in our Sunday Clubhouse events as well, and asks about publishers or clients who insist on all breaths being removed, or is there an industry standard? I've talked to them a lot about my standards, but does anyone have for out of interest, for the two publishers amongst us, how do you guys feel about the issue of breaths? I said that very carefully.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go first.
So kind of talking personally as an audiobook fan as well as a publisher, I like a relatively natural read. I like the feeling that that you're being read to by a person, and not by a machine or by an AI voice, has already been indicated. Sometimes, though, depending on the content of the book and the kind of style of recording, again, you do need to kind of clean it up and kind of smooth it out a little bit more. So I think I personally think there's no right or wrong. I think there's no kind of definitive way you can approach it. But I think the most important deciding factor should be the book and the content of the book rather than anything else. So yeah, that's my take.
I mean, I guess the way I see breaths is a bit the same way I see vinyl crackle. I think with most things, that disappears. Even if you notice it, if the performance is good, all of this stuff won't matter anyway. I suppose it's sort of a side note, but I think with breaths, as seems to be the consensus here, everyone does like a natural read and does like to hear their narrators breathing. I mean, I've found that quite often, actually. Sometimes if I listen to stuff and I just think there is no way they've gone that many sentences without breathing. It sounds a little bit weird, but that might just be my neurosis because I listen out for that stuff now. But I think generally we do like that because there's expression in breath, and it sort of again plays to this idea of a performance and a continuous performance. And yeah, I mean, to me, I'd much rather have natural breaths. Yes, I completely agree with Jen. There are some breaths that need to be taken out and they need to be dealt with. And again, it's always the same. If it's taking you out of the story or the book, then it's a problem, basically. But I sort of go in with the assumption that most listeners just want to know what's going to happen next. And so unless it's actually taking me out of it, and it's a really tricky thing, incidentally, to do, because if you're technical in any way and you've trained to tidy audio up, it's really difficult to untrain yourself from removing absolutely everything and over sweating stuff, because it's a discipline. Ultimately, you have to sort of take a step back and go, I'm not an audiobook editor, I'm a listener now. And I think that's a really tricky balance to strike.
For me, there's two types of breaths. There's performance breath and there's what I think of as technical breath. So technical breaths are in the gaps between things where the narrator's had a little pause, just taking a bit longer. I know the editor, or I as the editor am going to tighten all that up. I loathe the sound of a breath before the start of something. So that in breath before a paragraph or a new sentence, or if the very first thing you hear in the audiobook is the title by and read by, but it starts with it's like, oh, why has the editor not removed that? It's a bit like hearing the guitar string movement before the guitarist plays the note. It feels a bit lazy to me. So I think you can and should remove technical breaths, because that is part of improving the performance. But any breath that's within the performance, or as one of my beloved proofers likes to call it, the audio whiskers, so where people go and all this kind of stuff. I love that phrase, audio whiskers. It really applies to when we're doing Doctor Who stuff, because all the doctors have their little mannerisms. And if you just recorded and edited exactly the words on the page, it wouldn't quite sound like the Doctor. So I think those breaths, those little slipped breaths and extra breaths and character breaths are really important. But that then brings you to the issue of you can diminish them, and a good editor should have the ability to pull down. So if it's just a very loud breath, you can pull it down by half its gain. And that can sound beautiful then. Or, and I've done this with books, I've actually created a set of 5 or 10 good breaths, put them on 5 or 10 clipboards, and then removed the bad breaths and put in nice breaths. It's all very eugenic sounding though, that, isn't it? I'm just checking through the questions, see if we've got any other good technical questions for this particular section before we get into our general Q&A in a few minutes. Is there anything else, Jen, in terms of particularly as a producer, in terms of the technical aspect of things you have to think about? We've talked about mics. Obviously, mic position is important, and how people sit, how far away from the mic, the sort of mic they use. But when you're thinking about setting up a session with someone, what goes through your mind? What do you think about? What do you prepare for?
Making sure, now this is a controversial opinion, making sure they don't drink peppermint tea. Actors love them. I love it. And for me, it's the worst thing you can put in your mouth before a session. It just makes you incredibly clicky. Same with caffeine, we all know that, and milk. So I generally go, I won't offer them coffee because I'm mean. And and obviously movement. And I think tummy rumbles and making sure they don't just have a salad for lunch. Because it's hard when you're producing and you're listening to the story and you're listening to, and you're watching the words and you're doing all the things. It's hard to listen out for that. And, as an editor as well, it's very annoying. I think making sure that the actor knows that. And, we've all worked with seasoned actors and we see them downing their espressos before a session, and we want to scream. Peppermint tea, I swear.
Interesting. Yes, we try to enforce the no caffeine ban at Ladbroke, but it doesn't always work, has to be said. Some people just need it. But then you have that thing. I'd love on a future webinar to actually get a biologist or a medical doctor in to talk about stomach noises, because it baffles me. One day it's because of caffeine, the next day it's not. The only truism I know about stomach noises. Yeah, well, cushions do sometimes work, or sometimes don't. But the only truism I know about stomach noises is, interestingly, the smaller and fitter and leaner the person, the louder and bigger the stomach noises. So it's fascinating when you get these. We do books with, like, fitness coaches, and they're like little baristas going on down there. It's incredible.
Is it because they've got a cushion, a sort of biological cushion down there, essentially?
Well, I think maybe the larger people like myself do have that, but I wonder if the faster and better your metabolism, the more it's doing something down there. So you put something in and it starts working on it as fast as possible. But who knows? It'd be fascinating to get someone in.
I mean, I've heard all sorts of tricks, and doesn't ever seem to be anything, a one rule works for everyone. There are some things that work with the same person. I had a producer in a studio I used to work in who used to make actors run up and down stairs. I don't know if it made any difference, but they felt like they'd done something about it. So I don't know. I really don't know what the trick is to stomachs.
For long term, I don't think there is one. Everybody's different. The banana trick sometimes works, sometimes don't. The only one I've ever had work on every single person in terms of just trying to get to the end of a chapter. So say you got a couple of pages left and the tummy's just not stopping, is almost boiling water, and then you take a Ricola, particularly a Ricola, but it can be other cough sweets are available, but they are sugar free, so they're better for you, and dissolve it in the water. And then slurp on the water. It seems, it may just be the hot water in the stomach settling the acid down slightly, but it seems to help having the Ricola in it, and it could be any flavour. It doesn't seem to make any difference.
And have you had that work with different people, Neil?
Every person I've ever suggested it with, we've got to the end of the chapter with the stomach calmed down. It's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah, we have so many Ricola in our studio. It's mad. I should be sponsored by them. It's mad. I'll tell you.
Do you think it's a placebo because the process is so complex that people are just like, this has got to work?
Yeah.
Well, in essence, they've got to get up and leave the chair, which means obviously the diaphragm is relaxing and they're not pushing down. There's lots of reasons. That's why we need a doctor. Is there a doctor in the audience? Hey, listen, look, we're already at 6:45, which means it's our open Q&A for 15 minutes, guys. And we've had a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to start curating as I can. I've got two different screens, so if I look like I'm not looking at the screen for a bit, that's because I'm looking at questions. So let me go back and see what we've got. And we'll try and do these quick fire unless there's one that we particularly need to dive into for big stuff. And there will be some publisher-specific ones for our two publishing friends. I apologize, but they are interesting questions. So, but do feel free if you can't discuss them to bow out. But let's have a look, see what we've got. So here's a good one. Has COVID changed narrators coming into studios, and is more remote recording here to stay? That from Savvy. Let's ask Paul. He's a publisher who chooses whether things can be done in studio or not.
I have a feeling that to a certain extent, remote recording is going to stick around. I mean, I must admit, Orion were quite resistant again, in terms of starting remote recordings until COVID came on. But as the year has progressed, we've seen that home setups and remote setups have gotten better and better. The quality's got better and better, and people are just much more used to recording in that way, and getting their setup correct and making sure that you're not kind of suffering from a soundproofing and sound treatment way that, from not being in the studio. The big thing I'd say that it's really hard to replicate, though, is that interaction, that face-to-face interaction between the reader and the producer. And, we do, a few recordings have come in where you can tell the readers effectively recorded by themselves, sent it to the producer and the editor, who've then sent them their pickups, which they've done by. And you can tell, because you can tell that they're just, that they're not stopping when they're tired and they're not breaking regularly. And you're not getting those multiple takes to change from. So whilst I think remote recordings will stay to a certain extent, I think it's going to become more and more important that connection, that regular connection during for the duration of the recording is going to still remain. So we're not going to get to the point where everyone's just recording by themselves at home.
Good.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree from our perspective. That, we really went full whack out of necessity in terms of recording studios. I think in the first 6 months the first 6 months of me being at Penguin, we must have approved upward of 200 home studios, which was quite a lot of work. And And obviously, the question automatically comes up: oh, is this how things are going to be now? I absolutely 100% agree with the point about producing, and I think Rich and I actually have talked about this in the past. The difference of being able to make a connection with someone and being able to direct someone without having them in the same room it's really, really tangible.
You realise suddenly how much communication is done through face-to-face interaction, how much you can settle someone. Literally that.
But also those moments where you come out of the booth and you're making someone a cup of tea or just having a chat about their life with them. And it's building that rapport, which also builds the trust. And so it does mean if you do need to interrupt or tell them they've got something wrong, that they'll trust you more.
100%. And actually, I always find the first tea break on day one is absolutely crucial for that, because you've done an hour and a half's worth, something like that, and you can do a little debrief, and that can set the tone for the rest of the recording. So that 100%. Another thing I'd add is also logistically something that I'm sure Jen will agree with me. Editors not a huge fan, generally speaking, of uncontrolled environments to edit from. But the other thing I would say is also just, I think, being in your home and recording in your home makes it very difficult to have focused recording hours where this is the time when we're going to do it. And actually, when you're trying to, I can just tell you, like from sort of a production coordination perspective, it's very difficult to get two people, a producer and a reader, linked up and to make sure they stick to the time. And the whole production sort of tends to spiral more or less. There are some scenarios in which it works very well. I think it's impossible to have a blanket rule, would be my answer to that question. There are some situations in which it can be done. Is it always preferable? Probably not, would be my response.
Fantastic. Nice question here from, I'm using so many screens at once, from Jennifer, asking, actors wearing headphones, good in that they can hear their own mouth noises and breaths, or bad as the headphones can click with movement? I find them bad when people are wearing glasses because they creak, but other than that, good.
I wonder sometimes if you could get more out of a reader, possibly, depending on the reader and the book and the situation and all the rest of it, without the headphones on, especially sometimes first-time readers, because it certainly hearing your own voice back can be useful in some ways, but it can also heighten the weirdness, the strangeness of the process. And if you've got a producer listening there, this doesn't apply so much to home recordings, but in a studio, if you've got a producer listening there, I think sometimes you can maybe get a more relaxed, natural reading if you don't have the headphones on. The reader can just speak, and as we were talking about earlier, focus on the book and telling the story, and they suddenly lose something that's telling them, oh, I'm in a studio, I'm recording a book, I'm here, I've got these things on. They can just relax on them. So dependent on the reader.
I would also add, actually, technically speaking, I find that working on speaker is better because people tend to project more as well. And that means that you're not dealing with softer, more intricate, softly spoken things that the editors have to tidy up so much, because they naturally, because they're in a room, project more. That's my experience anyway. And I think that works, what you just said as well, in terms of self-monitoring performance. Again, if the aim is to get someone out of their own head and into this sort of imaginary world they're creating, to me, I mean, I'm not sort of militant about it. If someone wants to wear headphones, that's absolutely fine. And some actors prefer it. But I've often found, particularly, as you say, with inexperienced readers or first-time readers, that it helps 100%.
Okay, my little question disappeared off the screen there. Our next question is from Ben Firth, asking, what specific processing do you apply to the audio pre-recording to give a good sound in the narrator's ears? Effects pre-recording? I think that's a no-no, isn't it, chaps?
Well, it depends. Unless it means outboard gear and things like compression and sort of a high pass, that sort of stuff. Is that perhaps what we're talking about?
I think possibly, yeah. In which case, maybe. I mean, obviously, there's a difference between UK publishers and American publishers. Like a lot of UK publishers are quite relaxed about some pre-processing in terms of maybe a soft gate or a little bit of compression or even some EQ if necessary, whereas a lot of US publishers say absolutely not. We want none of that up front. As someone who came initially from the music engineering background, I was taught that source is king. So you always try to record as clean as possible, so that you don't have to worry about undoing things or not being able to undo things. So therefore you can do all that in post, hence our discussion earlier about when and where and if you do your mastering. But I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting one. I agree
to an extent. The only thing I would slightly add, but it's a personal preference. I think if you know how to use compression and you're pretty confident that you know what you're doing, if you can have it in line when you're recording, you're closer to monitoring the final product than as you're recording. And to me, I mean, perhaps it's a control freak thing, which I'm sure a lot of people would accuse me of, but I think for me it's just being able to hear at every stage as close as possible to the finished product. It just means that all the decisions are made earlier in the process rather than having to be fixed in post, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree that pretty much if you're going to do anything it's going to be compression, some kind of soft knee compression. It is one of the things that's tripped us up a lot when we've been doing over the last year editing of home recording, where the home recordist is using a temporary setup rather than a full booth where they've invested lots of money, is that there's been no compression on the microphone, and so you have those wild peaks and troughs, which of course make editing particularly difficult. I mean, I can go to Jen on that. I mean, it's editing anything that's got this wild variance of dynamics on it must be hell.
Yeah. It's hard, and it's also hard with a home studio, where like something I've been finding is that it's harder for the producer to monitor that, and to monitor because they can't see the reader moving towards and away from the microphone, and they can't hear as well because it's over clean feed or source connect or something and the connection's bad, and so you end up with peaks, and it's a lot harder, and that's the kind of sacrifice you make for a global pandemic. And at the end of the day, our industry has been, I mean, the publishers here are a lot more aware, but I know I've been really lucky in that we've still been able to work because of home recordings. So yeah.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and for the two publishers that are with us, and on behalf of for all the publishers out there, thank you. It must have been a scary enough time for you guys as it were, but then to have a whole industry of freelancers and studios and people panicking, and for you to find a way to work through that and to keep us all employed at some level was an incredible thing to do. And I know on behalf of all the freelancers I work with, a thank you goes out to the publishing industry, because you did amazingly, and allowing us all to, in fact, it allowed us all, I think, to learn our craft in an interestingly new way. I mean, at Ladbroke, we hadn't worked with people recording from home before. I knew how it worked, and obviously I had colleagues who did it, and I'd been an engineer long enough to know how to do it, but we had never done it. And actually that ties up with I think probably the final question we'll have for this bit of the Q&A now, which comes from Lillian, which is, would you consider directing an actor over Zoom whilst they recorded remotely? And in essence, the answer, of course, is that's what we did, didn't we? Yeah. I know if my colleague Morrison were here, he'd want me to say, if you're going to do remote recording, don't use Skype. And I don't want to say anything bad about any particular product, but the reason being that Skype has a tendency every now and again to take over the audio controls of your computer. And if you're using the same computer that you're recording on as you are using Skype on, we discovered a few times that and the narrator at home didn't notice that Skype had switched the microphone from the input, the main proper microphone, to the laptop's built-in mic. And so we get a chapter that was half professional and half sounding like it was recorded down a toilet bowl. And there was it took us ages to work out what was going on. And it's because for some reason that particular app decided to midway change the microphone settings. But guys, Jen and Richard, I know obviously you do a lot of this sort of work. Zoom, it's perfectly usable. Source Connect, anything else?
I've been clean feed.
I was going to say,
It's great. It's easy to use, and that's the thing. You're working with. You're asking a lot of actors for, like, you know, actors are now having to become engineers, and they're already got quite a lot on their plate. You know, working out Reaper and Pro Tools or whatever they're using. So the simpler the better, and CleanFeed is pretty.
And it's got a great, it's because it's such a simple, you can do it in others as well, but because with CleanFeed, it's got that record option straight in, you have a backup the whole way through, which obviously you can't use, but you can drop in little bits if you need to, and it's just a peace of mind that you've got something at the end of the day that you know, because you're controlling it. So yeah, I found CleanFeed great, But I mean, I've also used, I mean, literally just a WhatsApp phone call with one reader I remember we did, because we couldn't get anything else to work, just had her phone near enough, and we're checking that we weren't getting phone signal noise. Wasn't ideal, but it did work.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are some really good options out there that are either completely free or very inexpensive to use. And I think it goes back to what we've said all the way through, which is particularly if you're a narrator, and I think this is really important to reiterate. So I've had this question asked me several times, which is, you do have every right to ask to be put in touch with your producer. And even if you're the most experienced narrator, if you're getting towards a job and you've not been invited to speak to your producer and you're wondering about some stuff, just ask to be put in touch. Maybe through the publisher, through your agent. It just could be that someone thought it was going to happen anyway, or that the producer was going to get in touch with you. But that's the sort of question that, you know, what equipment do I use? Do I use CleanFeed? Can I just use Zoom? Ask Jen, ask Rich. You know, they can walk you through it and make it as easy for you as possible. And technically, you know, we'll get a great result at the end of it between us, because it's a great team effort. So great, it's 7 o'clock already. We're 1 hour in. Everyone's still here. Nobody's flagging. So that's good. We're doing very well. So I'm going to move on to our next panelist, who is the one and only Mr. Paul Stark from Orion. And he's going to give us the publisher's perspective on particularly the technical and production side of creating audiobooks. So over to you, Paul.
Sure. I also noticed, just quickly before I get going, there are a few questions about some of the elements of casting. Did you want me to tackle those at the same time?
We could do, but I think if we do that in the next break, or maybe towards the end of your section in sort of 10-15 minutes time.
Yeah, no problem at all.
If you're happy to, I know it's not technical, but if you're happy to, that'd be fantastic, because I know it will help people out. Otherwise, we can do it in the second Q&A session.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so as has been said, I'm coming at this from the publisher's perspective. Now, I'm not a producer myself. You know, I can listen to an audio recording and I can pick out kind of pluses and minuses and potential issues and things like that. And I know my way around a studio. I can sit in a production booth and kind of weigh in with an opinion, but I'm not I don't have the same depth of knowledge, of technical knowledge that the other panelists have. So I'm going to kind of approach things slightly differently. And when I was thinking about this question, you know, what's the publisher's perspective on audio production, what it comes back to kind of on all levels really is everything's built around open and honest communication. So from a kind of a properly technical perspective, what a publisher will need to do is they'll need to trust the producer and the reader they're working with, particularly if it's a home recording or a down the line recording. We're going to need to trust that the setup that you have is not just kind of technically well set up and quiet and well treated. The best way I've heard it, someone summed it up to me, is that there should be no clues as to where the book is being recorded. You know, you shouldn't be able to guess, this one's being recorded in a bathroom, or this is in a big studio that's used to produce music. You shouldn't be able to kind of work out what the setup is. But as well as that side of things, it needs to be really consistent as well. We want to make sure that the audio quality that we're getting is as good on day 5 as it is on day 1, and a lot of that is going to come down to trusting that the setup is going to be good and consistent. It's going to work throughout, and that if there is a problem, you're speaking to us as early as you possibly can and being as open as you can. And we know that's not because that's not always, or indeed not often, because anyone's made a mistake. It's just sometimes tech decides it doesn't want to work, or the house next door's decided it's wanted to start doing building work. If we're hearing about that kind of halfway through a recording when it's been a problem from the start, or the day before when it's been a problem for a week, it puts us on the back foot. So it's really important for us that from that technical perspective, you're keeping us in the loop as early as you can around any potential issues. On the technical side of things, speaking from Orion's perspective, so I manage around 300 titles a year. So we have a big title account for a very small internal team. So from a technical perspective, what we need to do is that we make sure that we can send out the masters that we receive as efficiently and as effectively as possible to as many retailers as we can, with as little tweaking as possible. So we will supply specs that are built around retailer requirements, and we kind of it's that thing that we know it might make more sense for the audio to be edited in this way, but we need to receive it in a way that the retailers can work with. And that's also why elements like file naming and silence at the beginning and end of a track are so important, because we have to make sure that we're not having to go into all of those 300 titles every time when they're delivered to tweak things, to change file names before we can send them out again. Really important for us that we have that kind of smooth workflow. Coming back to the point that kind of kicked off this whole discussion, the more we can front load the whole process, the better. So that early prep, that early communication, that early raising of any questions around accents and pronunciations is absolutely vital. I mean, I always come back to the kind of mechanical engineering adage, which is that you measure twice and cut once. The whole idea is that you do all of your prep early on, and then ideally you get the whole recording done in that first span of days. It's always a pain, particularly if you're working with someone with perhaps a higher profile, or if you're on a really tight time frame for the book. It's always a pain to have to try and find time for drop-ins and retakes a week after the production is finished. In terms of things that we like to see as publishers from a technical perspective, I always like to hear when my audiobooks are coming in having already been listened to by multiple ears. So I think we often see this kind of from the more print editorial perspective. If you've got the same editor who's worked on the book, for all of its kind of 7 drafts, and then it's proofing, and then it's second proofing, and so on and so on and so on, that can be kind of towards the end where some of the smaller mistakes sneak through that you can be perhaps avoided, because you kind of almost become blind to the words on the page because you've kind of encountered them so often. I think the same can be true for audiobooks. So I think it's really important that after that initial production and that initial edit, it's being listened to at least one other person before it's delivered, because you know that it's going through a fresh set of ears who can approach it kind of completely anew and just pick out any of those kind of any of those elements that someone else might have missed. Tying into that, a little tip for readers, and I'm saying this because we've been caught out once or twice with this. If the mic's on, please don't swear, because if the checklister misses it, then we're in trouble. And if the mic's on and you're not reading the script, please come out of character, because if you say something that shouldn't be in the book in character, again, something that the listener might not necessarily pick up on. Just to finish off in terms of, because I know this is something that's come up, I think, with a lot of the producers I've worked with before, and I just want to kind of give a note of reassurance. And this is the kind of things that we're not expecting from the producers in your role recording the audiobook. You're not there to approve rewrites on the book. Particularly if you've got an author in the studio and they all of a sudden decide they don't like what's on the page, that's something that you put them in touch with us to talk about. You're not there to say yes or no, or to try and have an argument with them about staying on the text. That's our job to do. Again, in that whole spirit of kind of front loading the production, you're not there to proofread the book for us either. If you pick up the odd kind of typo that slips through, that's fine. But we should be doing our job to the point where the book that you're receiving is final enough that there's not an error on every page. And if you are recording an author and for whatever reason they're unhappy with the text or with the experience, that's also one that you should be kind of sending on to us. You're not there to kind of apologize on our behalf or try and replicate them if they're having around things that you have no control over. So again, that open and honest communication. Do get in touch with us as soon as you can, and we can get involved. So
fantastic. Yeah. Wow, blimey, already learned something there. That's incredible. I was going to ask about the typos thing, because I don't think I've ever done a single audiobook where there isn't a typo in the in the manuscript, because that's just humanity. You know, we all miss something, and I've never known whether or not we report back or not. So
personally, I always like to get them back. We can let the print team know, and they can add them in. As I say, you might get, in very rare occurrences, if a book's on a really crash schedule, particularly if it's being read by the author, the audiobook recording might double up. We might tell them, you're recording your audiobook, this is your proofread, this is where your last corrections come in. But the studio would be briefed on that well in advance of time, so that you knew that you could build in more time and for that process. You do occasionally get authors who they won't let their books go to print until the audiobook's recorded. And we had one author who that I used to work with. She insisted that the audio was already recorded first, and she went to every session, and it was, you know, how she picked up all those last mistakes. And you know, it was an interesting way to work, but I think that's not very common, certainly not these days.
But the publishers are always glad to receive them, I would say, anyway, because even if it's for the next print run, then, you know, it's worth having them. I mean, there are always mistakes. I've just finished recording Dostoevsky, and there's still stuff to be reported back. You know, there's always something, and it's always worth feeding back, just because there's always a possibility of another run.
Presumably not an author read, though.
I couldn't say.
Making changes as he goes. Paul, you brought up a really interesting side topic there, which I wanted to get onto at some point during this session, which is the importance and invaluable role of the proof listener. We can't do what we do without proof listeners, and I'm shocked when I hear, and I do hear it quite a lot, where products have gone out without a proof. It's all been accepted that it's just within the edit phase, and I'm not damning the editor in that case. They may well have done an exceptionally good job. But again, it comes back to that point that there should be a minimum of 2, if not 3 listeners involved in an audiobook. It's the producer at the start, the editor in the middle, the proofer at the end. Of course, that may all be one person to an extent if you're a home narrator, but I'd at least hope a home narrator who edits and masters themselves would at least send it out to proof with someone else. So as publishers, both yourself and Chris, the importance of proofing, I just don't think it can be underplayed, can it?
No, absolutely not. They're like the last bastion before the masters are delivered. So absolutely. What I will say, though, is that we shouldn't be expecting proofers to have to return long proof reports. And what that means is as much needs to be fixed in the recording session, so you make those decisions there and then, in the edit, if possible, so that again, as far as possible, the way I like to think of it is, if I can, my QC files become the masters, basically, because I don't really want to have to introduce the possibility of a mistake at mastering stage, basically. And I think that also basically is fair for the proofers. The proofers should really be enjoying it as listeners with the scripts to make sure everything's there in place. But ideally, really, there should be very little for them to do. They should be able to really engage with it as a listener.
I mean,
and proofers. Sorry.
As I say, just to kind of to reinforce the point, kind of from my own career, and this is again kind of a print example that applies to audio. I remember proofing the cover of a CD edition once that went through 7 different iterations. I signed off the final one. It went to print. The CDs came in, and there was no author on the front, and it was because the author had dropped off at the 7th proof, and I'd been checking everything so many times in so many different places that I just missed it. And I think it's that thing is just having someone different, just going through it once, just it catches the things that your brain switches off to.
And I think it's incredibly important who you choose as your proofer. I mean, I've had people reproach me saying, oh, I have this qualification, I have that qualification. Is that enough to be a proofer? It's really hard to say who a proofer can or can't be is not necessarily about having a degree in English literature. I find, my best proofers, the people I work with the most, have the most all-round knowledge, and they do save me occasionally with a mispronunciation which I would swear as producer was right, the narrator swore was right, we thought we checked it was correct, the editor thought it was correct, but Susan or Kate or whoever picks up and goes, actually, and they dig out the research for it, and it blows me away every time. So having them be there almost as another producer to an extent, but also as another listener is key. Surely it really should be a slam dunk sort of set rule of the industry almost.
Yeah, 100%. There's no doubt about it. And for me, as I say, the proof reports I appreciate the most as a producer is when I can tell that the proofer has engaged with it, and that to me is probably a sign of success, because it means they actually have enjoyed it on some level. But I think to an extent that pedantry is a good thing in the industry to an extent, because it means that it keeps you on a toast. You might not always observe, and you might not always react to all the notes, but at least you feel like you're in good hands. And actually, trust of all the people in the process, the proofers are, as I say, the last bastion. If you can't trust them, then you've really got, you're really stuck. And their role is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. Well, with that in mind, then I'm sure. Sorry, I must get Rich and Jen more involved. I feel sorry, but this is such a publishing section, this one. So, but I'm sure this question will be something that you would ask as well as fellow producers. 100% accuracy, text to word. It's a difficult one. How do we all feel about it?
I mean, from a producer, editor, and I've done proofing as well. It kind of depends on the publisher, and it depends on the producer, and it depends on the book. If you're doing your War and Peace or Shakespeare, or it's something really classic that people can quote, then 100% accuracy. But if it's an author read, and they're kind of having a little play and changing little bits here and there, but it depends on your publisher. It depends. It's so many different factors. But I'd like to hear from all the other perspectives as well.
Well, I mean, certainly I prefer, as a producer, maybe you do as well, having that flexibility, knowing that especially with an author read, that you have that scope, because especially in a case where perhaps the author hasn't read it out loud when they've been through the writing process, then having that flexibility at that stage to just slightly reword things to help it flow, knowing that you've got that cushion is wonderful. But at the same time, if you're, exactly as Chris said, if you're recording a work of classic literature, I completely believe it needs to be word perfect. You can't change Virginia Woolf or whoever, that's the point. It's that way for, that's why it's being done. So it does just depend on the book, I think. Is there a standard rule for publishers?
What do the publishers say? On the spot.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I say, particularly for fiction, I think it goes back to the breath question. You want the recording to sound like it's alive. That it's being read by a person who's really engaging. So if the odd word here or there kind of slips or changes, provided it doesn't fundamentally alter the meaning, I'm usually fine with that. If you go too much off the printed script, then there can be commercial implications through kind of any app or system that syncs up text and audio, because it can't marry the two together closely enough. But I think you've got to go quite a distance before that becomes a problem. I think the problem, if you're talking kind of quite significant changes to a book, it does lead to an issue where you've just got two formats that don't match up. And in which case, even though you don't have a superior and an inferior format, and this is, one is the author's true intention, you do ultimately have two formats that don't match, and that's going to need to be addressed at some point. So you do have to be a little bit careful with it. But as I say, ultimately, it's it's got to sound something. It's got to be something that sounds right, and it's got to be something that sounds live. And if that means there's a little bit of slippage and a little bit of tweaking, and it's worth noting that there are some scripts that you have to change. So I've been working on a couple of non-fiction books this week where any references back to page numbers have to come out, and because page numbers are irrelevant, and you're sitting here reading this book doesn't really work. You have to kind of get that into something that kind of makes sense. So there's so you can start to introduce kind of intentional elements, but what you want to avoid is where you've got accidentally got two formats that are fundamentally different.
I think
Also,
as a producer, I was just going to say, for me, it's like the specifics of, can we do contractions or whatever the reverse of a contraction is where it's required, and if occasionally words will be flipped within a sentence, but the editorial is still the same. Is it worth having to get a re-record of that? It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we're all human. We miss these things because it sounds so natural being said out that way. So I just wonder if there's specific feelings from publishers about those smaller non-editorial changes.
So to me, if the way I see things is that most books aren't written to be read aloud. That's the first thing. So when you're making an audiobook of a book, you're to an extent creating a production of that. And what that means is it's everything depends on context. Unfortunately, it's not a very easy question to answer, and it's very difficult to come up with a blanket rule. The way I see things, and certainly the Penguin spec as it currently stands, is that there can be minor deviations where the sense is retained, and I think that's something that you see in studios as standard anyway. So things like contractions, again, unless there is a very obvious reason why something isn't contracted, then I'm absolutely happy to sort of allow. But again, that's a general rule. There's also got to be a matter of proportion, because if you're changing lots, then it's got to resemble the original text as well. So to me, the way we think about it is that there's a certain number of minor tweaks that we allow in an hour of finished audio. And so that basically gives us a level of deviation that we're happy with. But it really strikes me as an interesting question anyway, because obviously everything is context. And if you've got a work, for example, a classic work that's been translated from another language, you have to accept there's a level of deviation there anyway, because it's been translated from another language. And so if there are tweaks, and if the sense is retained, and if you've not messed with the translator's work, then to me that it seems just obtuse almost to sort of I've been in situations where I have to record things word for word, and apart from sucking the joy out of the whole process, it makes it very difficult for the poor readers. Because again, circling back to my point about performance and not worrying about getting all the words right and actually just lifting this stuff off the page, it's really hard to do that if you're being pulled up for, actually it said it is there rather than it's. To me, again, it's really difficult, because coming up in any way with a blanket rule in audiobook world is very difficult. The answer, as always, I have it time and time again, editors coming to me or producers coming to me with the question, what's the blanket rule for this word or that pronunciation or the way we do that? The answer is always, what's the context? And they get annoyed with me, because all they have to do is go and find the text and show it to me. And like, everything is context, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Apart from the word mischievous, which is pronounced mischievous, not mischievous. Yes. I'm going to say this here and now, everybody. It's never mischievous. I know now everyone's going to get on the chat and tell me that, but I said this. No. I'm not allowing it. I'm putting that rule in the sand now. Well, interesting, actually. Sorry, Jen, you were going to say something before I rudely interrupted you, actually.
I was going to talk about... no, I was going to talk about the issue that, as a freelance editor, and sometimes, I will edit for all sorts of publishers, and you don't necessarily know you know, if you're working for one particular publisher, they can still farm that out to different producers in different studios. And so you don't necessarily know the standard you're going to get. And same with the narrator. And the problem is that sometimes if you go back with every single quibble from the proofer, especially like mainly when it doesn't change the sense at all, is that you don't get a good retake that fits in. And retakes are hard. I've got opinions on them because I know a lot of producers will just, they'll do them and it won't fit in and it will make it sound worse. And personally, I'd rather you say rather than rather and it sound beautiful than you to sound like you've made a massive error.
I would chip in actually on that, is that to me, what one big sort of metric is ambiguity. Is there any ambiguity when you're listening to this in the sense, basically? And if someone says rather and it doesn't, and it's clear in context that there's no way they said something else, and it's okay to me anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, very, very quickly then, before we move on to Rich's topic, just an interesting one. I'm not going to name names, but we mentioned AI earlier for narrators, but AI for proofing, it's out there. Many people are using it. It has its benefits, its positives, but of course it doesn't give that human element of a human proofer being able to understand that an error isn't actually an error. Well, it's an error officially, but it works. It's let's call it a PRH minor deviation, as you call it, Chris, which is acceptable. It's non-editorial. It's fine. It can just be passed by, and so you will end up getting a lot more flags from an AI proofer. How do we feel about the use of AI proofing, if at all? If anyone's willing to answer, if not, we'll move on.
All I can say is, sorry, go ahead. It's not something I've ever used. I don't know if any of the studios and producers I work with have ever used it. So I would be uncomfortable weighing in on it until I'd had a chance to actually play with it and kind of try it out myself. But that lack of that kind of human understanding of the context would concern me a little bit. But then without having used it, I can't see how the interpretation would work. So
I have known producers that use it. The time that I go, yeah, okay, fine, is if you are doing, an hour session at the end of a 5-day read, and you've got a bit left over and you don't want to call that, and, it's been edited really quickly and proofs. No, actually, no. I'm going to say no. I don't think, unless it's an absolute last chance saloon, because the proofers who I like to work with are picking out performance. They're going, oh, actually, he didn't whisper that, or she didn't get the antithesis there. That's just as important to me than, saying, rather, they're not going, oh yeah, the pacing here is a bit off, or you've left a tiny breath in there where I think actually that needs to go, or vice versa.
Absolutely.
You need the human element, have proofers.
Which probably leads to the conclusion that basically, as ever with AI, it depends how clever the AI is. And right now, the AI is not clever enough to understand context, performance, character voice, all of that sort of stuff, as I understand it anyway.
I think you're pretty much bang on with a couple of times I've experimented with it. Yes, it is very accurate with that word to text thing, but it flagged up too many instances of what it thought were mispronunciations, but were just character voices. So it actually made a lot more work trying to work through the things we didn't need to flag. Great. Well, thank you, guys. Well, we're going to move on to our fourth panelist, who's been sitting quietly in his room with his Velux window behind him, making it shine with a little angel glow. It's lovely Rich Hughes, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the production elements when working with multiple voices. As we know, there's been a lot more big growth in multi-voice, dual voice, duet voice, and multi-voice audio books and audio dramas. So over to Rich, who is a bit of a past master at this area.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, so I got my start in the industry 15 years ago, so at the small publishing house who provided audio content mainly for libraries. So their focus was always quite minimal. It was quite factory line and quite, we just need to get this content out as quick as possible. So they were always quite reluctant to experiment in these areas or do anything really more than a single narrative voice. So for me, learning the trade with them, it was always this really exciting thing that I was, you know, wanting to get my hands into, and especially as I came from music background, as was mentioned earlier. Yes, I'm one of them. That it was, you know, playing around with audio was always the sort of exciting thing. And now, having, you know, very luckily had the experience of that in many different books over the last 10 years or so, I have discovered that though it is, you know, wonderful when it works well, it, you know, brings up a lot of challenges as well, and a lot of requires a lot of forethought, and it links in quite nicely, I think, with all the stuff we've been saying from the start about preparation right through the whole process, because it's more so with any book that uses more than one voice. Anytime you multiply factors that are involved in the production, you multiply the chances for error and for things to go wrong. So I think, I mean, I'm personally pretty interested to hear everyone else's views on this as well and how they approach it. So I think the best way to start maybe is if I just run through quickly a few of the things that I think about when doing these multi-voice books, and then yeah, see what everyone else thinks as well. So first off, there's the issue of whether it's just a multi-voice or more of an even bigger project, a kind of multi-source, as Neil I think mentioned earlier, not necessarily talking in terms of a drama production or dramatized, but just in terms of a book which might have all sorts of different, an audio book, but that might have all sorts of different clips of audio or sequences from elsewhere, little bits of music. I finished a book recently about autism, and the author was a composer, and so we had clips of her playing her audio throughout. She was an artist, a doodler. She sketched throughout, so we had to I had to find ways to try and bring some of these little cartoon sketches to life. But I think that talking in terms of prep, if we start from a position of just a multi-voice book, firstly, I think it's worth saying I totally think it's worth it if it goes well, because it really does lift an audio production. If you've got a book that's written from, say, 2 first-person narrators, having 2 different voices represent those 2 people as a way of immersing the listener in the story and involving them in that world, provided it's well done, of course, is invaluable, I think. So the first thing to do for me when getting booked on one of those is hope and try and make sure that there's one producer across all the different voices, especially if there are more than 2, because as soon as you introduce any second producer, again, it's another element of difficulty. So it's not always possible, of course. If you've got a book where you've got tiny bit parts, you might have it's quite rare, but it does happen. I've got some coming up actually that have a cast, I think we've got of 18 in one of them. So you know, it does depend, but although in those cases often a lot of those voices will be grouped and recorded on the one day. So hopefully you've got one producer across it, and that gives me the ability to make notes that I know are for myself and that I can keep referring to. Now, normally you'd obviously, as we discussed earlier, as Jen was talking about, you'd make a prep sheet and you'd look up your pronunciations in advance. You'd have all that. But I find with these books more than any, whilst you need that as well, what's super useful is making notes as you go throughout as well. The first reader in many ways sets a sort of tone, that there are certain things, consistencies of, say, words like either and neither, or whether you say either and neither, either and neither. I think, I'd like everyone's view on this as well. In the UK, we should say either and neither. I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure where I got that from, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's what it comes from. So, but little things like that. And if the book has different narrators, if you've got an American voice and a British voice, then you've got a choice to make there about whether you stick with American pronunciations for their sections only, or whether you mix it up. But making those notes as you go along to ensure consistency is absolutely the key, I think. So you've always got something to refer to. You've got, you know that ultimately everything is going to feel homogenous as it can do with those different voices, because I suppose that's the key, that you're trying to make it feel like one product in the end. Character voices are also a big challenge, assuming it's a work of fiction. There are characters to do. No 2 readers. You're very rarely going to find 2 readers who can exactly mimic a voice of another reader, or even do a voice that sounds exactly the same. So whilst, especially if you're directed in the text, you know, they had a specific Kirkcaldy Scottish brogue, you know, obviously you're going to have to try to do something that matches that. But wherever possible, I tend to find, as is often the rule with audiobooks anyway, but again, more so here, less is more. If you can find ways to hint and subtly suggest, then actually I think a lot of the time a listener can forgive if two readers doing the same voice, if one has done it, you know, if they've both done the voice not too strongly, but there's a variance, I think a listener can forgive that more than one has tried a very strong approach, or they both tried strong approaches that are different. So again, as you go, cutting samples, cutting clips, if you're recording the session, you're in a studio, certainly putting markers in is absolutely invaluable for where those character voices are, so that you can play those to the subsequent readers who come in to try and give them just a sense. But also vitally important in terms of the tone of the whole thing. Recently did a 7-voice fiction, really amazing book about a central character dying of cancer suddenly and leaving his family behind. And it was written so poetically, so sensitively and thoughtfully. And even with that style, it allowed for different approaches. And 2 of the readers, we needed to rethink the approach after doing it, you know, 10, 15 minutes, because it just wouldn't fit with what the other readers were doing, because you want to maintain that sense. Importantly, in this one, only one of the voices was first person in that. The others were all third person narratives. So they were the chapters were headlined with a character name, but they were all third person reportage. So it left less room for you know, really imbuing a different reader sections with a sense of character. They had to sort of all fit the same style or tone. So yes, that's all of that. And then after all the sort of prep area, there's the post-production side, because I work as a producer and editor as well. And probably spend my time about 50-50 with both sides. And of course, it's useful to be able to do both of those on a multi-voice book, because then you're across everything, you have that control. The downside, as we were talking about earlier and Neil mentioned, is you then lose that extra check process. And with a multi-voice, having more ears on it is absolutely vital when you've got so many elements. Having a listener, a proof listener, I mean, you couldn't release that without it, because you need someone to say, does it all sound like it's one thing? You know, does everyone sound connected? But yeah, the post-production side is a whole different bit. I've got notes on that. I don't know if we have time to go into all that separately, Neil. What do you think? Or do you want to talk about the pre-production first?
We're getting a little bit close on our time, so I actually wanted to ask you one question about the process, particularly the technical side. So
Sure.
If you're not recording everybody in the same studio, I mean, maybe on different days on this, but if you're not using the same mic, the same setup, how do you, as a post-production editor, producer, manage to, particularly with a non-audio drama, so something that's going to be over silence, how do you manage to balance everything? How do you work on that side of things to make it all not sound odd?
Yeah, well, it's difficult, and it certainly isn't made any easier by people home recording from lots of different places. That stuff, and that 7-voice one I just talked about was recorded in 7 different 2 studios and 5 home records. I wasn't editing that one, which I wasn't entirely upset about. But it depends on the book. So the first thing to say is, are the voices, is it set chapter by chapter and the voice changes? Or is it a more complicated piece where the voices are interchanging as we go through? Because in a funny way, both, I think, allow for the listener to adapt. But I think with chapter by chapter, you have a little bit more freedom, because the ear, we were talking earlier with breath, you know, it does, like the vinyl click, it's the same thing. You notice when the chapter changes, but within 20 seconds, especially if it's a good performance, if it's been well done, you care more by that stage about what's happening rather than you do about the different sound. However, what you can do, judicious use of EQ. There's a plugin by FabFilter. Their EQ has there are many others that do as well. Has an EQ match feature, so you can literally run one section through the EQ match, and set that in as a preset, and then play it across another section. And well, it can do it automatically, or you can manually tweak to try and blend those EQs. Sometimes that works. It's a real struggle. It's hard to get it exact. Sometimes actually less is more with this as well. It might be a simple case of just a bit more high pass filter on one to just get those that sound roll off that bass a bit more, or just the levels. It can sometimes be as simple as that. You can have two recordings and think, God, these sound absolutely, and actually once you've balanced them, mastered them, well, you can find that. Equally, just treating them the same, I suppose, is what this boils down to. You know, if you use the expander in exactly the same way, which is hard because you have to set the compressors right and get the levels right first before you get to the expander. But if you're doing those similar processes, that can be a way to help.
So, out of interest from our publishers here, presumably initially through early COVID, you kind of had to, I suppose, lower the technical standard a bit as people were using sort of jury-rigged home setups. But as we've now developed into a much more technically capable situation, and where you've got people like Rich sort of overseeing these multi-voice productions, do you have a technical threshold, I suppose you might call it, for differentiations between background sounds and tones and EQs? Are you willing to give it a certain amount of freedom?
Context. All depends on context. And, you know, no, I mean, I don't think anyone worth their salt could ever accept that they lowered the standard. I think what it always comes down to is any of this getting in the way of the performance of this thing, basically. And yeah, I mean, you know, I get sent different samples from different studios all the time, and I always have to make a call if things are going to be in the same production, whether they're going to match. And if I get an opportunity, I will always, if I'm concerned in any way, I will ask the clips to be sent to the editor and say, look, can you just do a little match on these two clips just to make sure that we're not going to have any issues. Of course, it's all about context. Sorry to be boring, but it is literally just context, basically. Is it going to get in the way of the story? Yes or no, basically.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back on a couple of points I made earlier, as I say, if you can work out what room it's been recorded in, it's probably not going to work, as I said earlier. So as I said, the example I always come back to, you can always tell if an audiobook's being recorded in a bathroom. It's just, you just can. But then again, it's the trust issue. So if I've got a situation where an author's, particularly with an author saying I can record from home, I'll go to the producer, I'll go to the studio and say, look, I've listened to this. I think it's a bit roomy, or it sounds all right to me, but I will ultimately trust the producer's view. And if they say, you know what, we can make this work, then I have to trust their superior technical knowledge.
Absolutely. Sounds the best way to go. Yes. So Rich, anything else you can tell us about multi-voice in terms of the technical side? Maybe if there's something that the narrators themselves should be thinking about doing, or if there's just basically anything else. It's such a fascinating. I mean, I know we're going to do an entire webinar on audio drama at some point, so we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. But yeah, what else could you tell us? It's fascinating.
I mean, as Chris said, it's context dependent. I mean, I've done a lot of different types of these kind of books recently, and a book about it's about the natural world and how we can use it in a mindfulness context. And that book, we filled it had two different voices. We filled it also with natural ambience throughout, so we're running that underneath, and that was a whole different challenge because we're running the sound. Normally you try, if you're involving stings or music or sound effects, try and keep them separate from the dialogue or try and let them speak things up, but this was running stuff underneath the narrative the whole time, so that was an interesting challenge. Technically, the route around that was using EQ to finding where the EQ of the background noise was, whatever it was, and then compensating for that in the vocal, so that you balance two and the vocal can stand out alongside whilst there's other noise happening. Because the key with all of these, of course, is to tell the story, to make sure that gets told, and anything you're adding, as we've said many times, doesn't distract. You know, that is the golden rule with all of this stuff. It's finding a way to make it add something to it. And as I say, when you start at that basic level with just there are two first person narrators, then having that second narrator is absolutely worth it. It certainly adds. And in terms of the technical side, at least in terms of post-production, it's not so tricky unless they're in very different spaces. But right down the other end, as you get towards audio drama, yeah, I mean, the possibilities are endless, and you can have some real fun and some real headaches, depending on
I
how.
would also, actually, just on a technical point of view, in terms of mixing, it's something. One of my bugbears with stuff that's voice should be the primary sort of component of it is when I hear mixes where the background is taking up too much of the mix. I think there's a difference between mixing for music and mixing for ads and mixing for all this stuff. With audio products, be they audio plays, audio books that are enhanced in some way, for me, the voice has to take up the majority of the mix, and everything else is built around it. And I think quite often, I think perhaps because sound designers might find it more interesting to listen to the background that they're creating. I mean, I find it heartbreaking. Sometimes I get sent music and I will mix it around them. And you see, when you play it back to the person who's composed it, you sort of think, well, the music's a bit quiet in this. And you sort of think, well, yes, but the music is second fiddle. That's the whole gig. And in a different context, you could have the music louder. But I think where if the whole focus of the product is on voice, then the voice has to physically take up the majority of the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of the things I've always respected with our friends at Big Finish, that when they have these incredible composers working for them, they understand that the music is necessarily underneath the dialogue, but they'll then release the music either at the end as a full score or as a separate CD later on. But the composer will nearly always have a route to the audience to let them hear the full score. And that I love that. I think that's and it's great to add that onto an audio production as a little bonus feature for people to enjoy, particularly. So that asks the final question about that then, because I'm going to ask Rich, but actually it's our publishers and Jen, your experience is really important here too. If you've got 2 or more readers, who reads the credits?
Yeah, and who reads the part heading? You know, there might be part headings in between the chapters. I mean, for me, the answer is usually whoever has the majority. And if no one has the majority in terms of the amount of text, does one of them feature more? There'll usually be a way to figure out this character is more in control or more focused or more featured. And if you haven't got that, flip a coin.
Oh, Jen, what would you prefer?
Go with a woman.
Yeah,
Just 'cause women are best. Feminism.
Could I offer a middle way? I used to do, in the old studio I used to work for, we used to do both. So it would be the title of the book by da-da-da-da-da, and then the other thing would be read by da-da-da-da. And the first person to speak would be the first person who says the titles, and then you've heard both voices and you've identified.
That's nice. Just reminded me, actually, with the 7-reader one I mentioned earlier, we had the main narrator do most of the credits, but read by, and then every narrator said their own.
Nice.
Which is
I
quite
like
nice
that.
doing it. Yeah.
The other option is if you're bringing the author in for a studio visit to see their book being recorded, ask them to do the credits.
Nice.
That's good.
That's sneaky man management there, Paul.
Diplomacy.
Well, we've got 15 minutes left, which gives us, we've got 14 minutes left, I should say, which gives us 40 minutes for questions and hopefully answers. So I will ask our audience to get busy with some questions if you've got any, whilst I look quickly back through the previous questions. So we'll start with Douglas, who's asking, how do you deal with dialogue from a perpetrator, for example, a killer in a thriller? But the killer is anonymous throughout the book, but actually is one of the main characters and has been given a very specific accent or characterization. So basically, how do you not give it away? I don't know if that's a technical question, but I'm going to ask Jen from a producer perspective.
Yeah. My go-to thing for that, and again, depends on the book, and is less is more, and maybe go for the narrative voice. Maybe go for the narrative voice, unless it's, that would be my first thought. But I think, play with it, and maybe liaise with the publisher, maybe liaise with the author. But that would be, I think, if in doubt, use the narrative voice. Same with song, like don't sing a song.
Yeah,
I totally agree. In your narrative voice.
Yeah, that would be absolutely my view as well. You're trying to do what the book is doing, right? The book is keeping it anonymous, so it's our job to try and make sure it's anonymous as well. So it really is that simple. Which of course
don't spoil it. Yeah, don't spoil
don't spoil it.
Narrative voice. Yeah,
that's a great situation.
Sorry, Paul.
that's a great one where it's good, always good to record lots of options. You know, to try in lots of different ways, and then we can send that to the author. And because we've done it we've had this kind of situation a few times. We've done the whole kind of computer distorted voice. It works in some scenarios, doesn't work in others. We did one recently where you're supposed to think the murderer is American, and it turns out they're not. And we had a reader who could start with a hint of the accent that just kind of fell away as they went through the book. But you need a really good reader who can do that. So give it a try in lots of different ways. Have fun with it, because it is ultimately a really fun kind of element to a narration, to a production.
And in fact, I think it's the key moment when you're prepping the book as a producer or narrator to quickly bring that question up as soon as you can, to go back to the publisher and the author. The most famous one I had was we were doing a new version of the original Planet of the Apes, and I don't want to be careful not to spoil this, but I'm sure most people understand the basics to Planet of the Apes. But there's a whole opening chapter which is written, performed as though it's a couple of American astronauts, but you learn later on they're very much not what you think they are. But how do you choose what to do the voice? If you do the straight American voice, then it's maintaining the pretense, but also it's not actually in line with how those characters later on are going to be heard to speak. So we that one batted backwards and forwards a few times, but actually we've had a really interesting sub question here from Genevieve, and I put this to you all. But why don't we sing songs in audiobooks?
Copyright.
Yeah,
that's the short answer.
And bad singing.
And bad
singing. Yeah, that's tricky. That is tricky. I've been in those situations before. Essentially it's just a case of the tune can't be reproduced in recording form, and you need to find ways around it, and there are ways around it, and you can it's the same as I come back to the perpetrator question. It's a similar thing. They seem like really tricky things, but actually once you've got that sort of suspension of disbelief that comes with having a sort of omniscient narrator who can choose or not to do certain things, then you can sort of get away with a lot of it.
Yeah, I always think of it as just perform it like it's a poem is generally your best backstop position. Okay, from Helen, tech question. That's good. It's a tech webinar in theory. What are your preferred microphones for home record setups? Are there any to avoid? Ooh, this is one we talk about a lot on Sundays, I can tell you.
Neil, why don't you start us off? What would be your favourite?
Well, actually, in a way that like Chris has his backstop position on certain things, mine is always the microphone is less important than the space that you're in. It's all about the environment you're recording in. It's the size of the room, the size of the space that you can record in, making sure that's right. Getting that sounding good is important. There's so many people who race out and spend a couple of £1,000 on a Neumann, or a couple of hundred, £500-600 on a smaller Neumann, or a very expensive Sennheiser, and then they still get bad sound because those mics are so good. Neumann mics, mostly, particularly U87s and U89s, are designed to be used in big open studios, mostly with acoustic instruments. Of course, they can be used for vocals, of course, but in a very specific way. In the same way that, the Shure SM, can't remember the number, which everyone likes to buy because it's good in podcast videos. That Michael Jackson made that famous because it's designed for you to speak right up into it like this. It's a very near field microphone, but that's not good for audiobooks because we want warmth and dynamism. We want quiet and highs and lows. So what I always say to people is, if you're setting up a home system and you want to just obviously focus on your environment, but start with a Rode NT1A. You can't go wrong with it. It's a good standard microphone. It makes everybody sound decent. Be aware of that the 2A has different sound to it, a different thing. But obviously, when you're buying any Rode, as Chris said, little gold silver dot, make sure it's pointing at you. Very important. But yeah, start with that because it's inexpensive. It will work for most jobs. It will sound good in most environments. And most importantly, it won't cost you a lot of money. And if any client says to you, you have to have a Neumann microphone to record into, then I'm sorry, they don't know what they're talking about. Buy a second-hand one that's broken and take a photograph. I've done that.
I mean, I would strongly reinforce your point about space. It's a conversation I've had God knows how many times in the last year and a half. It's all about putting the effort into the space. All the effort that you can put in the space can be substituted for all the money you might be spending on the mic. I mean, obviously there's a threshold, you know, that you do want a condenser mic ideally.
Absolutely.
NT1As are pretty good. But you also, it's an interesting point. I found this actually, that again, thinking about the post-production and downstream, if you've got a microphone that's going to pick up every single detail, is that really what you want? Not necessarily. So it's all about, you know, there is an optimal range that works for the whole process, and it doesn't have to break the bank, basically. But you do have to work really hard on the space.
Absolutely. I do see a lot of people like to use shotgun microphones. They have their purposes. They're very good at they create a very narrow, thin space into which to speak. And if your narrator or you yourself can sit in a very consistent position, it's very good for particularly areas where you do have some background sound that you need to keep out, particularly if you've got sort of low rumble sounds. But again, the second you go off axis from them, you move off the microphone slightly, you get into boxiness and weird noises. And as Chris says, the problem with the more expensive microphones, not only do they pick up absolutely everything, they also require much more expensive outboard equipment. So you have to buy expensive amplifiers. Neumanns need a lot of power to get a decent volume out of them. And so you're going to have to start buying expensive equipment. And you're not just going to be able to plug them into a Scarlett 2i2 or something like that. So, you know, these are things that when you're starting out particularly or making that big investment in a home setup, and you're not going down the route of spending tens of thousands of pounds building a full home studio, start, as you say, start with the space, start with the acoustics, and start with a microphone, which if you then choose you want to go up later, you can go up later. Don't worry about it. But it will work. And it'll work very well in a duvet fort. I can tell you that. I just want to see if there are any other nice questions as we're going along here. So let me just have a look on my screen over here. Okay, this is an interesting one from Sam. If you're working with a blind narrator, so it's quite a specific role, so anyone who's working with blind or partially sighted narrators, would you prefer them to read their script from Braille or to use a text-to-speech to read their script and then they repeat it back? Have any of you had any experience with blind or partially sighted narrators?
Just for once, they read from Braille, and I'd say kind of it ties into the kind of the paper versus tablet kind of question in general, which is, provided you know how to read kind of in a way that doesn't require a massive edit either way, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you feel most comfortable with, that will mean that the kind of you get best read out of yourself. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
That nicely leads us to, I think probably need to wrap up after this, but the idea of using paper scripts in studios, which is a thing that pops up every now and again. Obviously, some narrators need it from an eyesight point of view. There are some people who just don't want to use a tablet or can't afford to buy a tablet, and that's absolutely understandable. But understanding it from a producer editor's point of view, and I can already see the look of despair on Jen's face about editing something where it's written read off of paper, and that's fine. I have the same problem, which is how to prep a script, a paper script. I can talk about this, but I'm the moderator. So would I, Jen or Rich particularly, or Chris, as producers, like to give some advice on how to prep a paper script?
Yeah, I mean, the key, I think maybe touched it earlier, I can't remember, is marking up where the page, when you need to turn the page, marking up in advance what text is on the other side of that page, so that you can continue a sentence continuously without having to stop, break, turn the page. Paper noise, for anyone who doesn't know is listening, is impossible to remove underneath vocal because the frequency range is exactly in the same area, and also the texture of the sound is just, it's impossible to take out, so it has to be avoided. So that's probably tip number one, is absolutely make sure you've got those marked up in advance, because it will make it smoother. Yeah. Also, when you're actually there reading off it, having enough space, having a good amount of space, you can have maybe 3 laid out in front of you at one time and then move the pages across. That's a helpful technique as well.
Which is important, just to interrupt, is important therefore for the publisher, whoever's supplying the script, to make sure it's not printed two-sided. It does still happen.
Very important.
And for
Yeah.
preference, if the publisher or the client can actually prep a script in advance so that there's actually no line breaks. When we do Doctor Who at our place, I go through every script in advance and reformat it from scratch so that there's no line breaks. So you can actually, you never have to move a page. Actually, what we do is move pages after every 3 and then sort of do them in bulk. But if that's possible, I know it's hard because publishers haven't got enough time to breathe and eat and have lunch. But if it's specifically something that can be done, otherwise, just as long as whoever's printing it doesn't print it double-sided, I think is probably key, isn't it? Great. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank our awesome panel. Thank you so much to Jen and to Paul and to Chris and to Rich for taking so much of your time. I hope you're not taking away from any important football. I have no idea with football, but I'm sure something somewhere is being kicked by someone against someone else. But thank you for your incredible time, your skill and experience, and for making this the first one for me such a success and such a joy. And I hope some of you, if not all of you, will come back for future ones as and when it's something that appeals to you. And I'd like to thank all the audience, of course, for being here, asking questions and being involved. We're learning as we go, so I'm sure we'll get better at this as we go along. I know there's lots of questions we didn't get around to because of time. So what I'm going to suggest is you can, of course, always get in touch with me via my social networking through Facebook and Twitter. You can find me. Normally I'm Twitter, I'm at HocusBloke, but also you're very free to join us via Clubhouse. If you have Clubhouse, it's free to join. We have invites on a Sunday evening from 5 till 7 p.m. when myself and Morrison, both from Ladbroke Audio, do our Sunday schmooze with audiobook producers, where we talk this kind of stuff, endless about microphones an awful lot of the time, but it's always good fun. I'd also like to thank Harry, our vision mixer, who has absolutely made us all look so cool. I admit that the other 4 always look cool. I've got a special coolness filter that Harry has applied. So if you meet me in real life, I don't look this cool. I don't have this sort of lighting. It's just not true. It's not real. But thank you so much to ReAttendance for being so good to us, to Emma and to Peter and Hugh for helping make all this happen. And I hope you'll all join us for the next one in a couple of months' time. We'll work that one out. And if you're not already a member, join the ACA, the Audiobook Creators Alliance. It's free. We're looking for people to help redevelop it and move it forward into the future. So if you've got any kind of interest in helping your fellow creatives in the audiobook industry push ourselves upwards and to higher heights, then get in touch, become a member, and see if you can help me out do that. That would be fantastic. So I think we're coming up to time. I don't have a little clock to count me down, so I'm kind of vamping a little bit here, but I'm sure Harry will send me a little wavy face or something. Here we go. He's just told me. So I'd like to say thank you very much once again to everyone. Have yourself a fantastic and safe weekend, and I'll see you all very soon for another audiobook adventure together. Bye.